So these are the key questions that I'll address during my presentation. And please feel free to jump in, make this collaborative. I'm okay with that. So a lot of times, what we've been finding is, there's this big thing out there called sustainability or resource management, energy management, carbon footprinting. But a lot of companies don't know how to get started. It's kind of like, how do I take baby steps? How do I baseline? Where do I find the data? How do I report? And some of the people in this room may be more advanced than others. Some people have been doing this for a few years, some several years, some people are just getting started. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, just to kind of walk through that. And then what needs to be measured. So once you get started, what needs to be measured? And then do measurements require an assessment, meaning do you need to have some kind of assessment that goes out to your organization that collects qualitative or quantitative information that you need to do your job more effectively? Because you've got to remember, right, if you're a sustainability person in a large organization, sometimes you have 1, 2, 5, 10 people, but you really are responsible for the corporate sustainability initiative. So it requires a lot of people, a lot of interaction, a lot of collaboration throughout the organization. And then I get this question a lot from people mostly on the outside of sustainability. Is this a one-time thing? Do I just do this once a year? Why should I have to hire people full-time? Why do I have to buy software? Is this a one-time thing? I can bring in a consultant, get it done, and I report and I'm done. So I wanted to go through that a little bit. And then once you kind of get all that taken care of, how do you get elevated to the C-level suite? So you can start justifying more budget, more resources, and start showing the value around sustainability. So those are the things that I'm going to walk through. So just a little bit who we are. We've been around for a few years. We were founded in 2006. And CSR is really for corporate social responsibility. It was before a lot of the cool words around sustainability and green and carbon. But it still resonates well, since CSR is about environmental, social, and economic. And I know Nicolette's going to talk a little bit about the social aspects, which we think are still very, very important, even though they don't have as much teeth sometimes, and you can't always quantify it or monetize it. It's still very valuable to the organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later. We focus primarily on energy and sustainability management. And what that means is really, how do you make all this transparent? I heard Laura, and I know some of her issues that she's grappling with. It's a mess out there, and how do you get all the data, and then how do you create transparency around it, and then put some controls in place so you can do it on a more regular basis. And then the whole idea is, once you do get your arms around this data, how do I create this kind of system of record, right? This kind of auditing, accounting system, so that you can then figure out how to optimize your environment, maximize your shareholder value, and manage risk, right? You want to mitigate risk as much as we can. So how do you get started? We could argue this, I don't know, visibility, right? I think it is about visibility in some respect. Establishing very clear strategies within your organization. You don't want to go to the boss or the CEO or the CFO and say, look, I need a bunch of money, I'm going to do this sustainability thing. No, you need to have a strategy. You need to align it with the business goals of the organization. And then figure out, how do you gain, intelligence around what to measure, and then deliver on the goals that you set for the organization. And then you want to measure, right? So what are you going to measure, and then how do you identify ROI around all these different initiatives? And I think that's obviously I just came from another panel discussion, and ROI was the topic, and I think everybody's trying to figure out what's the ROI around all of this. Whether it's buying a software, how quickly does it pay for itself? Whether it's implementing solar panels, what's the payback period? There's a lot of questions about ROI and how to get there. And then, how do you turn this into less of a cost center and more of a profit center, right? How do you improve this whole integration, this whole workflow aspect, so you kind of streamline this, right? So you can start thinking. The idea is, how do we get the sustainability people out of just collecting data, doing manual, rudimentary things, and getting into a more strategic position, to help identify ways to reduce costs for the company and to simplify the integration of sustainability across the organization. So So in my opinion, this is what needs to be measured. I mean, this could go on and on. This could be a whole slew of things. But to kind of get started, right, what do you want to measure? Well, under the environmental performance indicators, a lot of times everybody's looking at energy use, right, or costs. And when we say energy, energy means so much, right? It's really the energy mix. You know, are you using natural gas, or are you bringing in clean energy, coal, dirty energy? I mean, what's going on? And then how much are you spending, right? So you want to measure all that. The same with greenhouse gas inventory. A lot of people are starting to look at their own products. Water usage is another big component of sustainability. Sometimes it's ignored because it's cheap, but it's a significant part of all this. And obviously waste, especially when you're dealing with manufacturing products. And corporate social responsibility, again, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it is important to kind of figure out how you address some of these issues, because if you're looking at some of the reporting bodies like the Global Reporting Initiative or some of the others, they're going to ask you specifically about labor rights, human rights, or labor laws, human rights, how your business is impacting society. So those types of things, it'd be nice to make that more transparent and more integrated into sustainability. And then looking at your suppliers. So there's this kind of internal thing going on, and then how do you measure and manage the suppliers? What do you look at? What do you measure? These are some areas that you might consider. So this is a whopping crazy cycle of sustainability and sanity. So the good news about this is once you kind of get the cycle in place, that first step is really I don't know, it's kind of the nasty, where's the data? Do I have to integrate into some building management systems? Are there sensors out there? Who has the Excel spreadsheets? We're global, how would we get it all together? Well, once you get all that, then you have a nice little data repository. And this goes back to addressing, making this repeatable. And the fact of the matter is it's not a one-time thing, right? This should be a living, breathing cycle that goes on within your organization. So you're not scrambling at the end of the year to do your carbon disclosure project report or the GRI report or anything else you're reporting on. This becomes an integrated part of your overall operations. And I would say that the most interesting thing is kind of, as we kind of turn the corner here with management feedback, looking at the financial benefits and also improvements. So that's where you get the ROIs, that's where you get the scenario planning concept. You start getting into, okay, we're not doing well. We're spending tons of money. We're consuming a lot of energy. Well, what do I do about it? And that's where baselining and setting goals and then tracking it and looking at trends can kind of help you address those issues. So, data input is challenging, as we all know. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of put a face on collecting the data that you need. And this kind of goes back to, do you do qualitative or quantitative or a combination of the two? How do we simplify and put in front of people so that they can easily log into a system, enter the data, it sends them reminders, it triggers alerts, and it gets all the information into the system. It has drop-down boxes, all these different things that a lot of the technology solutions will give you today to kind of simplify this whole approach. But it also addresses the ability to kind of get your whole corporation engaged, because now you can send out, call it a survey, call it a scorecard, call it whatever you'd like, but it's an ability for you to kind of get the questions out there. They're going to help you do your job more effectively. A lot of you, I know, have been inundated with software tools and dashboards and everything else. This is another one of those. But the idea here is, all I wanted to be able to display here is, once you have that data, you can now make it more transparent, and you can start tying the financial benefits around why you're doing these things. So if you're implementing a bunch of initiatives, right, you've just asked for a $10 million budget to implement a bunch of sustainability initiatives, well, you need to be able to track those, you need to be able to show the ROI, you need to be able to show the energy cost reductions against the greenhouse gas goals that you've hit. And that kind of, again, it ties it back into the business and helping C-level people understand the benefit to the bottom line. And this is another way you can do it, right? So again, sometimes you just want to give a snapshot view of, I'm saving a lot of money, company, so you better give me more resources and more budget, because I'm going to be able to save not $4 million like I did last year, but I'm going to be able to save $8 million, and here are the reasons why. So again, it's a way to kind of And you can do this with any tools. I mean, this is, you know, this is not to promote our tool. This is, you could do this in Excel, you can do this with other tools. It's really just kind of showing that if you can show your investment in the initiatives, show the return on that investment, show the cost savings to the business, I think you get a lot more support. So that's my message there. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bruce, unless anybody has any questions for me.
Let's do that at the end. We'll take all the questions,
very
okay?
good.
Okay, there we go. So, nice to see you all again, and welcome once more on behalf of Applied Materials to the conference. What I really want to do is try and give you some perspective from inside a company about what sort of measurements matter. And I think Christine in her remarks earlier mentioned that you really move from strategy into execution. And to execution I would add management. There's a lot that goes into that particular realm. And then into communications. And I think what we measure and how we use those measurements depends upon which of those particular areas we're in. And that's what complicates the endeavor. We need a lot of measurements as a result of having to operate in all those areas. And I think the other thing we're talking about today and tomorrow is that from the communication standpoint, we're not talking just about internal communications. There's also issues pertaining to our external communications. So you really have to bifurcate when you get into that area. Now, I think more than one speaker has already mentioned, you know, this old adage, what gets measured gets managed. I believe when I looked it up, it was attributed to Peter Drucker. You know, and perhaps taking a cue from some of the writings that Gil has put out there, I'd like to explode that myth a little bit. It's not true within a company that everything gets measured, that's measured is managed. The sad fact is that we collect reams and reams of data on many, many dimensions, and it really takes a commitment on the part of the group collecting that information to look at it carefully, to analyze it and understand how to act on it, and that translates into management. So in the realm of corporate responsibility and sustainability, I think we have to very carefully look at what we are measuring and whether we really intend to manage using that data. I can tell you from my group's perspective within Applied Materials, we are very often retiring metrics on a regular basis. We look at information that we've been collecting, we determine that we're not using it in a productive manner, and then the effort to collect that really is unnecessary. And so we want to cease that particular activity. That's something every organization needs to do. Now, among the considerations that I hope we can discuss this morning are what sorts of considerations need to go into creating the appropriate measures. I've listed a couple here on the slide: the units of measurement, the coverage, the frequency, the ease of access. That's something that both Nicolette and Karen are involved in terms of making data more accessible and usable. That's very, very important. But again, the ability to really use that data and analyze it, from my perspective, inside is really the key. And then lastly, a lot of the discussion today really is about who are the audiences for that data, what are your purposes in using it, and I mentioned already internal, external, and whether it's really for a management purpose, or the other thing I think that's going on in the sustainability field is we are now collecting a lot of information strictly for the purposes of communication. Sometimes it may not even be used for management. Ideally, from my perspective, again, I don't want to collect anything that I'm not also using for a management purpose. And sometimes I have to resist the request or the urge to collect something strictly because somebody is requesting it for their informational purposes. So one thing I wanted to leave everyone with, and you're probably all familiar with this notion. I think this is a very experienced group. I think within the corporate responsibility or sustainability community, We use a lot of jargon, there's a lot of shorthand references, and I think from the communication standpoint, we have to be very careful. I know when I communicate, particularly internally, a lot of the things that are part and parcel of my job are not familiar to my fellow employees, and I'm absolutely certain that that's the case externally as well. In the case of Applied Materials, we're a business-to-business company, technology company, in a very specialized field, and some of the things that we take for granted, that we talk about every day, are not easy to communicate to external audiences. We assume that they're immersed in the same types of issues that we are, and that's simply not the case. Now, again, this being an experienced audience, I know most of you are familiar with the Global Reporting Initiative and their G3 guidelines. That certainly is emerging as one of the standards to follow in terms of external reporting. I took a quick look at their most recent reports on their website, and they indicate that 1,500 different entities are using that standard currently, but there's still quite a number of large companies and other entities who do not follow that particular standard. It's multi-dimensional. I believe it's got over 350 indicators presently, 27 alone in the environmental area. I can tell you again from my own experience, I don't collect data across all those 300 plus dimensions because many of them are not relevant to my business. Now the result is that when we do our external reporting, I have to set up straw men all the time and knock them down. I have to refer to that indicator and then indicate that it's not relevant to my business. So in an attempt to be extraordinarily comprehensive and complete in its coverage, a standard like this also creates some issues for companies in their communications. One thing to keep an eye on recently, I noted in some of the newsletters that GRI is now partnering with the Prince of Wales and some other organizations on something called the International Integrated Reporting Committee. They really haven't produced anything yet to my knowledge, but it's something to keep an eye on. The other thing that I've also seen some companies do, and I just want to leave this as sort of a cautionary tale, at least from my perspective, in my opinion, is if you attempt to create unique measures, they may be useful from an internal standpoint, but from an external communication standpoint, I think they're problematic. I've got two on this page. They're probably very difficult for you to see out there. One at the top is called Factor T. This is something that the Toshiba Corporation produced. The one at the bottom is from RICO's environmental report. And in that particular report, they have something called their ratio of eco-profit, REP, the REE ratio of eco-effect. They have an eco-index, and then they have a ratio of profit to social cost. That's a strict mathematical calculation. The other three involve formulas. I've been an environmental professional for my entire career. I looked really hard at both of these indices, and it really was not something that I could easily understand. So from the communication standpoint, I didn't find them very effective. As a manager, I might find these measures particularly valuable. I'm not certain, but if you get the urge to move in the direction of creating your own index or a standard or indices, be very careful about how you use them. Now here's what we're doing within Applied Materials. I just wanted to touch on this very briefly. We have a new consolidated worldwide operations group, and one of the things we're doing is creating some new scorecards. So in addition to EHS measures, which are not shown on this particular slide, I've got a sustainability scorecard that we proposed. Now, it will cut across, we have 8 major factories, locations where we assemble our products. In each of those locations, we're going to measure carbon footprint, electricity usage, natural gas consumption, where that's utilized, water usage, and then we're going to create one ratio of hazardous waste generated to the numbers of systems that we ship. And then lastly, our solid waste diversion rates. And so the important thing about the scorecard from the management standpoint is it's going to enable the senior executives to compare one site to the other. And we also will be referencing our goals for that particular reporting period. So fairly streamlined. None of these are remarkable, but this is sort of the tip of the iceberg. Underneath this, my group and the managers at those sites will be tracking many other metrics. Now, from the standpoint of employee engagement, in our most recent employee survey, we do this on an annual basis, we asked the following question of all 13,000 plus employees. Applied Materials is environmentally responsible in the community, e.g. implementing sustainable business practices to reduce our carbon footprint. Now, why did we ask this particular question? It was not one that I composed or anyone else composed. It was a question that already existed within the group of questions available through the surveying group that we had employed. Now, I was very pleased that there was a question of this sort in the survey, because it meant that we would then be communicating with all our employees on this subject. It wasn't necessarily the way I would have composed the question, but it allows us not only to look at our responses internally, but also to compare them to other companies who were asked the same question by this particular outfit. It happened to be Towers Watson in this particular case. The other ways that we have measured employee engagement, fairly straightforward again. What are our participation rates in various contests, events, surveys, and how many people click through or access things like our reports, our blogs, and so on. And one of the things I hope you all can contribute to me today is some new and different ideas about how to really gauge the level of employee engagement or culture, because I think that's a very slippery notion. One other concept I think bears mentioning, I believe Gil or one of the other speakers made reference to Walmart. I can tell you that even though we're not in Walmart's supply chain, we're not a consumer goods company, they are certainly the 800-pound gorilla as far as I'm concerned in terms of supply chain management. They put out this following questionnaire to create their own index, and they will be distributing it to 100,000 plus suppliers worldwide. So that is having enormous impacts throughout all supply chains who are grappling with the notion of how do we understand what this data means, how do we collect it. Many of these companies are very sizable. In our own supply chain, for instance, we deal with companies who are bigger than we are, but who are supplying us various components and so on. But we also deal with a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises, and I can tell you that when confronted with a questionnaire like this for the very first time, it can be very overwhelming in terms of how you respond and get yourself prepared to answer. And if you have as much clout as Walmart does and your business prospects really depend on maintaining that relationship, you're going to figure out how to respond or else, essentially. And I know some of you in the room are probably helping suppliers confront this particular challenge. Lastly, I just want to leave you with the notion that we're not in a static state of affairs at the moment as far as standards and labeling and so on is concerned. It continues to evolve. One site I look at all the time is called ecolabeling.org. They've got over 350 labels and standards on that site described. I just threw up some that I thought were kind of colorful here. Even having prepared this slide a number of months ago, when I go back and look at it, I cannot recall what each and every one of these labels are. I certainly do not know what the criteria attached to each of those labels are and what they are meaning to convey by putting that label on a particular product. Some of these I'm a little bit more familiar with, but there are some entities hard at work now in creating new standards. Green Seal, they're in the middle of this slide. Underwriters Laboratory has another attempt underway to create a standard. I think it's 880E is the designation. It's over 70 pages long, and it references a couple of dozen of other different standards. So the notion of certifying your operations against that standard is really a very large undertaking. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, in this discussion we're having about metrics, is that standard, that collection of criteria meaningful to me? And if I undertake the effort to get certified against that standard, how am I going to use it? If I go from the bronze level one year to the silver level the next, or to the gold, is that meaningful to me and my colleagues? Is it meaningful to my stakeholders? Is it worth the time, the effort, the money, and so on? These are all very relevant discussions for a lot of companies today. So I'll just leave you with these final thoughts. We're going to try and address this when Nicolette concludes her remarks. As I mentioned, do we need these sorts of standards? Does it really contribute to our companies and to our stakeholders? What sort of complexity do we really want and need? I mentioned we have a fairly streamlined set of metrics that are our key metrics. Do I need 350 or 370 indicators for my business? And then lastly, I already posed this question, and I hope you all jump in with some thoughts on this. How can we develop more and better metrics in the area specifically of employee engagement? Because I think we're all trying to get our colleagues and our supply chains, our value chains further engaged. So thank you. I'll turn it over to Nicolette now.
Alright, so I'm going to throw a slightly different perspective into the mix, and I come at this topic managing social responsibility within SAP. So yes, we're a technology company. Yes, we provide software to help manage data. Yes, we understand what's out there in terms of voluntary standards. But to us, even, it doesn't always make sense what we're trying to communicate and what the messages that we're trying to bring out there. So what I want to do in a few minutes is give you a perspective of what SAP does, kind of, I call it the hearts and the minds of sustainability. So what we do in the mind is how we report on our data, how we report on our progress. And what we do with our hearts is really how we mobilize efforts around this and really use our employees and everyone who works at SAP as a catalyst for positive change in society. These are two fundamentally important components and cannot be seen separately. And I hope that from this we'll start a conversation to really, understand what it's going to take, because I'm sure that you're all grappling with a ton of questions on this too. So if you look at SAP, I wanted to give you a perspective, and I really enjoyed the earlier panel conversations where we were talking about the jargon around sustainability. What are we calling this? Corporate social responsibility, corporate responsibility, sustainability. And so when we look at SAP as a company, there really are two important roles that we play. So one is, if we look at the business case, bringing it back to that, fundamentally the business case for SAP, where we differentiate ourselves, is as a technology company, we have the opportunity to provide the solutions to our customers to commercialize sustainability, which sounds odd in itself. But basically, we enable our customers to run more efficient operations, to take waste out of their supply chain, take waste out of everything they do. So it's kind of along the lines of that lean process of making sure we're more efficient. At the same time, we can't do that without being a role model of sustainability ourselves as well. So this is where we have to actually, it's like eating your own dog food. It's like saying, okay, we need to manage our own footprint. We need to make sure that we're also very sustainable as a company. And so that's the terms, and I'm deliberately not using the terms because I know that there'll be a lot of questions around that. But when we started the sustainability business case, and this was only 3 years ago, the label, so to speak, that we attached to it was SAP as an enabler, so helping our customers to run more efficient sustainability operations, and SAP as an exemplar. So this is our role model function. And then if you take the organization that sits underneath it, and I'll just want to stress the fact that sustainability sits within the business. We're not a separate incubator, we're not a separate group. We do have a Chief Sustainability Officer, Peter Graf, who reports directly to the CEO. So this is fundamentally a business function. There are three important levers. So one, again, is the solutions, where we align this very closely to our branding and our positioning externally. So we try to make the world run better is SAP's overall branding. So within that, we want to be a trusted innovator. So trusted innovator being that we are a partner to our customers, and we're a partner to everyone we work with to provide solutions. Secondly, we have an operations function. So we have a VP of operations who just looks at how we can be a best run business ourselves. So again, it's attached to our brand, it's attached to our messaging. So SAP runs SAP, ultimately is what we're saying. Finally, the social aspect is how we then provide a role in society to use our core assets, being our people, our technology, and our investments, to really become a social innovator. And to do that in a setting where we work with our stakeholders, where we work with other customers. So this is a co-innovation, a customer function, ultimately, to really provide, again, that role as a catalyst. We're not trying to do anything new. And I think this is my key message too, is we shouldn't try and do anything new. We should actually be in the business of collaborating, and we should be in the business of trying to find the right partners to drive positive change in society. So that's the organization. And so where I come from is really that social background. So where is our role in society? How do we actually do that? And what's interesting from a measurement perspective, and that's why I'm really pleased to be on this panel, is that it's really hard to measure your social impact. It's really difficult to put a framework around really what your impact is, from mobilizing your employees. You know, your employee engagement is so incredibly important. But how do we communicate that, and how do we put some kind of value to it, other than you know, the GRI indicators, which it's great, but it doesn't cover that heart function that sustainability has. So what we do have is in our report, which is online, and I just wanted to highlight, so again, if we take it back to SAP as a company, so as a role model, as an exemplar, we use our own software to manage our data, collect our data, and then report out. And we do it every year. This is our third attempt, and we realized after the second attempt that really fundamentally flawed in all of this reporting is that we don't really engage any of our audiences in the right way. So first of all, who is our audience? Our audience is our customers primarily. And even though we'd like that to be our employees, it isn't. So what we've done in this report for the first time, it's all online, and we've built social media into the report. So there's a platform that allows our stakeholders to interact, to engage, to comment. So in every section of the report, on every topic that's relevant potentially to you, you can go in and engage. You can say, well, okay, great, these numbers around carbon footprinting, that's wonderful, but what are you actually as a company doing, you know, in partnership with other customers? This is innovation, because what happens is we can field some great ideas for future efforts. So we've said we'll report on a quarterly basis what all our stakeholders are saying, and we'll field 10 new ideas. So our goal is, by our next report, we will have 10 new ideas, innovation around how we should be communicating, who we should be engaging, what we should be reporting on. So that's really to take it away from just the dry reporting of, you know, let's take the GRI indicators, let's map what we have, let's do all of that, that's great. But it actually, from an innovation perspective, it's not really going to move the needle at the end of the day. So, so that's really why the report, I think, is very useful. It's also an example of how customers can do it. So we'd love to talk to people how to do that, but at the end of the day, the challenge still remains that if you look at all these indicators, the ones that are strongest are environment and our economic indicators, but the ones that are weakest are our social indicators. Within social, what's strongest is those that we can measure. So it's around our employee turnover, employee health, we have a health index, women in management, employee engagement. So you can actually report on that because you can gather those data. But what about how have we used our technology to help women farmers in Ghana to get connected to a global supply chain? How about we've deployed our technology and implemented it with the Ghanese government, and it's helped them to be more transparent about and more accountable about how they do business. How do you capture that? How do you capture that? So the only way we felt that we could capture it is by going out, talking to people, and capturing that on video, and capturing the stories and case studies, and starting, and I heard this before earlier today, starting conversations. Conversations is what it's all about. So at least from the social perspective, it's not as easy, right? So if you talk to people about what the value is, what you do, how you do it, you need to find other modes of communication. You need to find other ways to convey that message. And so that's what we're doing. So we're actually not excluding one or another. We're saying this is our platform for our annual report It's very important. It's kind of us talking to sustainability professionals, all our customers. This is who we are. But on top of that, we also want to make sure that we have those conversations with the people who in our societies are really making great strides to improve their communities, which we call creating better communities. SAP is a global company, 50,000 people. We have over 92,000 customers. We have over 2,000 sustainability solutions customers. But we don't really know how many people we're positively impacting through our work. And we don't really know who's benefiting from that in our communities. So I think that's really, and I'm going to leave it there because I really hope that this will open up, a conversation and we can continue from there. How next year, if I would be here again next year, I would love to be able to say, we have been able to positively impact 1 million people and X, Y, Z, so that we could actually put a target to this and actually make us work and run towards truly fundamentally creating a better world. So that's it. I can stand it. I'll stand here, it's okay.
Any good questions?
You lost your seat.
It's okay.
I was just curious about your employee engagement number there at 69. And what goes into that number? And I think that was a similar question you might have at the end of your slide deck.
Should I take it fast? And then
Yeah.
Okay. So employee engagement for SAP, we go out with an employee survey every year, and we ask them a lot of questions about their job satisfaction, and so it's a combination of, it's HR going out to our surveys and our employee surveying them. So that's the key.
So that's just a percentage of people that responded? Is that?
Yeah, so you have an X percent, I don't know what the exact number is of people responding, and that's just a percentage of it. Yeah.
I mean, my own view, we do the same thing. We measure employee responses, but I don't consider that to be much of a measure of engagement, particularly with all the arm twisting that goes on by executives and others to get the participation rate up, right?
Well, then that begs the question, what do you want them to participate in? Like, if you want to prove their participation, what are they participating in? Like, is it reducing their footprint? Is it improving their health? And how would you get metrics around those sorts of indicators? And there's platforms out there that you can do that with. I'm just, if that's what you're looking for in terms of getting a proof that they're actually doing things more than just volunteering on weekends or on Friday, but whatever, like if it's an ongoing commitment.
And it's a really good question. I think so in SAP's case, we have a health index where we're trying to see how stress affects people's jobs, what would be required to make them feel healthier, things like that. But if you go to the core of employee engagement, from a CSR, from a social perspective, it is about how can we go from painting a fence and doing a one-off activity to really deploying professional skills and our core assets in technology and leverage that in our communities and in everything we do, because that increases employee satisfaction and engagement as well. So I think you have to go back to the kind of the
I also think there are many measures of employee engagement across the different dimensions. So if I were looking at community affairs, for instance, I could look at how many participate in the giving program, how many volunteer hours, and so on. To me, what's elusive is this question of how do I gauge or measure my culture, right? And there probably is no single measure for that. It's always going to be a number of factors. The question is, how do you relate them all to one another and determine whether or not culture, whatever that means, is trending in the right direction or not? And this is a challenge that extends into all sorts of issues. I've thought a lot about company culture. Sustainability is just one of the latest areas where we're grappling with this. It extends into the safety management that I'm responsible for. It extends into a lot of other areas. And I think, Years ago, company culture was much different than it is today. I always use the example of Big Blue, you know, all the IBMers, you know, sitting at rows and rows of desks, you know, who are all inculcated in exactly the same fashion. That doesn't exist anymore. Our 13,000 employees are in many, many different countries, speaking many languages, with completely different backgrounds than you or I. And so what resonates with them is much different than what resonates with those of us here in North America, for instance.
Another example where we're intrigued by this culture change is we have sustainability champions who get 10% of their time, working time, to dedicate to creating awareness around sustainability issues, to really drive some of that behavioral culture shift. And they go out and it's partly successful. So it's a little too kind of engineered almost. It's you know, a culture management change initiative in concept is really great. Then we also have volunteer ambassadors who go out and they just organize events and they mobilize, and it's hugely successful, and the rates just shoot up every year. So I think, you know, deep down, I think we also have to see what's actually going to increase, you know, what is going to increase that level of employee engagement ultimately, and how to do that. And culture shift takes a long time. So, yeah.
We have one here. Gil?
Thank you to all of you. It's an interesting panel, and I appreciate a number of things each of you said. Karen, you talked about how difficult it is to measure the social. I guess all of you spoke to that. And Bruce, observing that sometimes you need to drop measures, not add them. And Nicolette, your observation that it's really about the conversation. So I have two questions. And the first is to you: is what do you want the conversation to be about? And then to all of you, what if we concluded that we couldn't measure culture? Or what if we concluded that we shouldn't measure culture? What would we do?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the conversation, I think, through the conversations, you get more to the point of what you really want to talk about. I think the conversations that we've started to initiate is across our regions, asking very specific questions about, one, what does sustainability mean to you? Two, what should sustainability mean to SAP? And three, how do you engage personally on sustainability issues? And so it's interesting because we asked everyone from the managing director in Africa to our chief information officer in India, to our managing director in North America, to the facilities manager in Germany. And there were a few things that came back that were consistent, and there were also a lot of things that were really widely, vastly different. But what was consistent is that everyone wanted to engage personally on the topic of sustainability. It was their own personal belief system. They wanted to take it home. They wanted to be able to, whatever they did at work, they also felt that that was what they would do at home too, and vice versa. What was really different was that, for example, in Africa, when we asked what should the focus be, it's about children and education. And if you go to North America, it was a very different topic. It's about climate change and reducing our energy usage. So, you know, there's no kind of firm answer about what the conversation should be, but I think it has shown us that we should have that conversation, because I think we make some assumptions sometimes about what it should be that it's not always correct. So.
Gil, you always have good questions. You know, I don't think we can measure society, right? All aspects of social impact to society. Personally, I think we can distill it down. I think we can go at it from an organizational perspective, and maybe over time, as these larger organizations establish how to make it real, make it part of the culture, make it more of an integrated process, see some value, and people really engage. At that point, maybe there's some real specific type of standards and questions that we can ask of others that will allow us to figure out how to better measure society and our culture. But that's such a broad question. And that was
Let me
my
just
answer.
make one comment on your second question, Gil. I think the reason we're addressing this question of how do we measure culture, because we've all set ourselves to the task of improving or enhancing our culture. Every single one of these corporate responsibility reports, or close to 100%, probably say that one of our principal objectives is to engage our employees, more thoroughly, and to integrate sustainability into the company's DNA, what we're talking about today. So, maybe we'll get to the point where we're mature enough that we can just say, I think our stakeholders and the majority of our employees recognize that we have transformed the company in some way. I don't think that when there really and truly was an HP way, for instance, that anyone had a measure of that company culture, nor does Patagonia have an explicit measure of how thoroughly its employees care about the environment and their social responsibility. So I think what we're after is what you talked about this morning, is how do we really integrate it into the company. And as the Supreme Court once said, I'll know it when I see it, right? And maybe we'll move past that particular discussion and just concentrate on other indicators. I know that in our case, because I'm in the execution phase a lot and I'm seeing not as much traction on initiatives as I would like, to me those are indicators that the culture isn't where I would like it to be. I don't get the kind of responses I want.
No, it sounds silly, but I think it's a really important answer. If I ask you, how's your health? You could quote cholesterol levels and you could quote resting heart rate. What you're really going to talk about is how you feel and what you're able to do. So, it's sort of a challenge. I'm as much of a metrics geek as anybody. Any of you who know me know that. But I think, restraint is a really interesting thing to consider.
So, hello. My question is maybe a little bit of an extension of what Gil has just asked about measuring culture, and it's really around the idea of if you measure something that is in nature altruistic, meant to be a good thing, meant to be out of the giving of basically your heart, and you're saying, I'm going to put a number around that, I'm going to put a dollar value around that, and I'm going to put a measure of what I get out of that, doesn't that somehow devalue that act of giving? Doesn't that somehow create less of a value there just in the fact that you're trying to measure it and just in the fact that you're trying to communicate that has ROI? And I guess my question is really around how would you communicate doing these activities and making them worthwhile? Maybe around not measuring it, maybe around not putting a number around it. Any comment there?
Yeah, we don't, so we put a number around things like, and I guess, we're a technology company, data-driven, so we're all data geeks, we all like metrics. But we put metrics around number of hours and the number of people that are engaging in these activities to show not how worthwhile it is, but to make other people see, wow, we really are as a company all coming together. It's more around mobilization. But it's a whole different conversation to talk about the value of those activities, because that's something we haven't put metrics around, and we don't at this point. We're trying to see how best to evaluate that, and at the moment it's through, we've launched a people campaign, which is a video campaign where people demonstrate what they do, and they actually talk about the value of what they're doing, and they interview the organizations that they interview the organizations they engage with, so that there's a little bit of kind of that PR for the organizations too. Like if it's with Habitat building houses, it's almost like, rather than me just doing that activity, can I interview the person at Habitat to demonstrate and to talk about what they do for society? Right, it's those types of things, and those are not metrics, those are stories.
I think your question highlights one of the growing sources of tension in corporate responsibility and sustainability, at least from my perspective. So many indices and so many stakeholders are demanding more and more data and are very disdainful of the anecdotes and the stories that we used to tell in the early days of reporting. So those, in our view, we tell those stories because we feel good about them and we hope others will feel good about them. But some stakeholders now will dismiss those entirely. So the other day, the new index was described, the Global 1000. They have 200 separate metrics that they use to create that index over all the dimensions. There's no storytelling, there's nothing from the heart in there. There's no way to measure, what's in the company's DNA. So I think from a communication standpoint, that's a fascinating debate to be having. Do we keep going in different directions, or is it converging somehow? I really don't know the answer to that.
What's interesting, just to, Bruce, to comment on that is our CSR function reports to communications, not to the sustainability function. And you'll see that in many companies. I've actually seen it in many companies, because fundamentally that is a function of communications. And because you're trying to interact with people and to get that message from people across, there's a risk in moving that into sustainability. It has nothing to do with organization or politics. It has to do with the fact that if you do that, then it does become more of a numbers game often, because then you are really tied to the standards and the reporting metrics and everything that comes with that. So in our case, I mean, this is a classic example. We can measure some of our HR-related functions and indicators, but a lot of what the others, the real people stuff, so to speak, we can't really put that number to it, and we feel quite comfortable keeping that way so that we can really use communications as a vehicle to get those stories out and as a vehicle to talk about people in that sense.
I just wanted to comment on that because I know specifically in your presentation, I don't mean to pick you out or anything, but one of the things you mentioned is that if you come back next year, you want to be able to say, I've impacted so many people, I've impacted this many people that were not your customers and were not your employees. So I'm assuming you meant the society, right, your general public.
Yeah.
And so that becomes that value where you're trying to do something good and altruistic, and all of a sudden you're putting a number on it. So it's that kind of thing.
Well, impact doesn't always have to be a number. Impact's value, right? So I think performance can be numbers and metrics, but I think impact and value can be communicated differently. It doesn't necessarily have to be a number. I don't know if you have any.
Karen, did you want to add? And otherwise, we'll close.
No, I just think it's a really challenge. I mean, what you just brought up about, I've always run into philanthropic organizations being under CSR, communications, PR. It's just a different people, different skill sets, and I think they're focused on doing good for the community around them, and I think that's good. I'm just not sure how it integrates at this point, at this stage. I don't know how it. Because with environmental sustainability, people do want tangible outputs, right? They want tangible results. They want to be able to measure performance. They want to see an ROI, and that's just where it is today. But I think over time, there can be an integration. It's going to take a little effort, I think, and education.
But you bring up a really important point, is that whatever we do in social responsibility has to be aligned to the business.
Yeah.
So otherwise it's not sustainable. So if we don't use our technology, our people, and our investments to drive good in the society, then we're not going to we can't just write checks it's the classic philanthropy, moving beyond philanthropy to really moving towards investments. And so if you look at a technology company like SAP, that means that rather than write a check to the World Food Programme for them to only just use that in disaster relief and to feed people, we could think about how can we use some of our technology to run some of their operations more efficiently so we can save more lives. So it's that kind of distinction. So I think, and that's what I mean.
Then your business will pay attention to it.
And it has
Right.
business value.
Yes,
So
right.
ultimately, that's what I mean. If I come back next year and I can have a story like that, that would be great, right? So that's
Selling
that's
more
why-
SAP products, that's the goal.
All right, I think on that note, we need to break for lunch. Would